Hola, gracias a todos por estar aquí. Esta conversación se va a desarrollar en inglés. Gracias por estar aquí, chicos. Thank you, Naomi Beckwith is Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And she will be in conversation with José Esparza Chong Cuy, Curator of New Proposals. So, thank you guys.
Gracias, Diego. Bueno, gracias a todos por estar aquí. I'm super excited to have to be able to sit down for a minute and talk with Naomi Beckwith and hear a little bit about her practice as a curator. Naomi and I were colleagues as of I was also working as a curator at the MCA Chicago a few months ago, so it's fantastic to be able to have her back or to see each other again and have her in Mexico City, which is she's been here several times. It's also something that I really respect about Naomi's practice is that she's a very committed traveler and she really follows kind of like certain kind of artistic groups and Naomi's very committed to doing this kind of like field research. And it's fantastic to be able to have her in town for a few days, visit the fair, meet some new artists, and maybe like have some nice weather as well. So I thought it was a really good excuse to have Naomi in town for a few days and save her from the insane cold that's in Chicago. So it's a pleasure to be back, and it's going to be a very informal format. I basically only asked Naomi if she could talk to us a little bit about her practice and maybe a few exhibitions that you worked on or want to work on, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A if anybody has a question. So, gracias.
Thank you, Jose. It is absolutely a pleasure to be back here, both for the weather, but also because I am a massive fan of Mexico City. I think Jose and I, besides sharing, I would like to think, a gift for kindness. We both share, I think, a very big concern for what has sometimes problematically been called the Global South. And we are interested in those areas of the world, outside of Europe, outside of North America, and particularly what cultural exchanges can happen and have happened between these areas. And so one of the things I find incredibly special about the city is that it seems to be a wonderful linchpin between the North and the South, and then South to South. And so it's very important for me to come back to Mexico often. So thank you. Thank you for the gift of the trip. In addition to just some projects that Jose asked me to speak about, he also asked me this question: what is the job of a curator now, especially outside of an institution? So I've made a very particular decision to work inside museums. This is important for me because I do believe museums are the place where art history is written. But I also understand that it's important to be outside of my museum, both for field research, but also for making connections and establishing relationships. But the first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question was, well, how many museums do you see now during this field research? Many of us are constantly traveling, constantly around the world. Everyone has an Instagram account, and everyone else is jealous of all the curators' Instagram accounts because they get all this travel around the world. And so I asked a favor of the assistant in my department. I told her to go on Instagram and find me on Instagram. Now, I don't have an Instagram account. I have never made an Instagram account or Facebook. I'm not on social media at all. But what's amazing is other people have done this work of putting images of me on Instagram, and almost all these images are me somewhere outside my museum or outside of Chicago. So there is a sense even now that to be a museum, to be a curator, is to be outside of the institution constantly. I'm somewhat ambivalent about that, right? On the one hand, yes, this field research is important, but on the other hand, there seems to be more value attached to being outside than to doing that research. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying, how are we weighing what we do? So I just decided to throw up a little piece of my resume, which is not so much about being outside of the institution, but understanding that my work has to happen in the museum, at the MCA, but also outside the MCA. I particularly believe, as a curator, And if you haven't noticed, I'm an African American woman. But as a Black woman, my job is to advocate for Black artists. My definition of Black is very broad, but I believe that I have to do this work both in exhibitions and in writings, but also in work that happens outside of the NCA. That means sitting on boards, that means sitting on committees for the city, sitting outside on committees and juries around the world. And so what I'm really interested in is how do I do multiple levels of advocacy? How do if I can't make a show for an artist, how do I also make sure they get money? How do I also make sure that I can write about them for books? I can't give everyone an exhibition, but I can seed little things for their career around. So this is what I really think my job is. And now a little bit about my shows. I have really crafted my my work around doing two things, and that is looking backwards. So thinking about history, but specifically about the historical narratives that we tell around artists, especially Black artists. But I'm also very much interested, of course, in present, looking at the now and into the future. And when I am making exhibitions and I'm writing, I'm very much thinking about making arguments and establishing stories that should reach into the future. I don't like putting up shows just to say I did something. I want the show to be significant, and I just put up images of artists that have been incredibly influential to me, specifically Carrie Mae Weems, who I did my thesis on, and she's the work on the left and right, and the outside said, from here I saw what happened, i.e. I'm here in the present, looking back. And then in the middle are two stills from a film called Handsworth Songs by the Black Audio Film Collective out of London. And this was a really interesting film that was an experimental documentary, an incredible experimental documentary that looked at the unrest, civil unrest in London, in Black communities in the 80s, and decided to make their own story about it. So instead of talking through the news, which always says something negative, they created their own version of history. So looking back, but also looking at the present so that it can reach into the future. I was born and raised in Chicago, and on the south side of Chicago in particular. And Chicago is a city known both for its arts, but also for its music and food, and so forth and so on. This picture was taken in 1968. I wasn't yet born, but it's a picture of a group of musicians who were part of a collective called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. And the photo itself was taken by a painter who often collaborated with the musicians, and many of these musicians were also visual artists. I put this up only to say that this was the kind of cultural milieu that I grew up in Chicago, where painters, dancers, visual artists, people in theater, actors, directors, they were all collaborating with each other. And so in my work, again, that is about advocating for Black artists, it's also thinking about multiple disciplines working together. How can we think of an art history that can encompass all of this at the same time and not separate out everything in these neat little categories of painting and sculpture, performance, what have you. Another artist that's been super influential in me and I've worked with in the past is Senga Ngugi. So she's born and raised in Chicago, but about the same time the AACM is really active in Chicago, she's on the West Coast. And she is a woman who's a dancer, trained as a dancer, but becomes a sculptor. And all of her sculpture comes out of dance. And what's amazing too is I've seen some really interesting work in the fair this year too, like Mariela Scafati, that's thinking about these bodies that are suspended in space, much in the same way her sculpture was. But she didn't just make sculpture. She started a collaborative studio. David Hammonds, some of you may know, was one of the artists who started the studio with her. And she would set up these performances under the freeway system in Los Angeles. So kind of in public space, but not really public. A space that used to belong actually to African American communities, but then the federal government came in and created these highways, displaced the community, and so she wanted to turn it back to a Black sacred space. And so I put this up just to think about how in Chicago, this multidisciplinary practice wasn't just hot there. You could see it, especially among African American artists working around the country. So this has really absolutely influenced my work. And in 2015, I put together a show that then traveled called The Freedom Principle. And it is a show that was an homage to the founding of the Association for the Advanced of Creative Musicians. So here's a visual art show in a museum that is thinking mostly on a music history, but again, a music history that has resonance in the visual art world. And here you see some works. In the foreground is a work by an artist, Sanford Biggers, who created a work called the Ghetto Bird Tunic. And he puts this on and performs in it sometimes as kind of ritual performances, but he also has a band. He's a musician, and so he performs in this as a band. And then above is a work by, oh, I'm still thinking, sorry. I think I danced too much last night. A work by Renee Green. And above are many quotes about freedom, about music, but she directly quotes the AACM, the jazz musicians in the work. So it's not just me making up this history and trying to put the story together. In many ways, artists are doing it for me. And it's important for me to follow the artist in that way. Just last weekend, I opened an exhibition of a woman named Howardina Pindell. Howardina Pindell has been a great influence on my life as both an African-American woman and as a feminist. And the first work I'd ever seen of hers was a video called Free White in 21. And it's a video where she talks about her experiences as an African-American woman in the art world. And she takes on several guises, and you can see on the far right, she also talks back, literally, to white women who kept telling her that she was crazy. That these negative experiences that she had, she made up, or that they weren't important. So she had to make this work to tell this story. And the first time this work was seen in public was in a show that Ana Mendieta curated at the AIR Gallery, the Artist in Residence Gallery in 1981. And so what it also shows is this great history of this kind of collaboration across women of color, especially that time in downtown New York. But I also love Howardina because she's an experimental painter. She started as an abstract painter and then moved on to making work that was a lot more politically engaged, just like that video was. The works are huge. They're amazing. I mean, I don't even know meters. This is like what? Like 2.5 meters by like 4 meters or 5 meters. And that's small. I mean, she goes big. She goes really big. And these are works where she's stitching pieces of canvas together, bit by bit, to build it out, almost like a quilt. So again, she's looking to craft. She's looking to non-art traditions to make the work. And she's also quoting other painters and other artists. The Target is an homage to Jasper Johns in many ways. And you can't see the details here, but she makes these works also by kind of using these handprints. There's almost this hash mark working itself around the painting, and those hash marks too are an homage to Jasper Johns. So she's thinking about both the history of painting, but also women's work, women's labor, craft. And it's something, as I said, it's been really, really formative for my thinking about art. The week before, Howardina, I've been a little busy. I opened an exhibition called Prisoner of Love. Prisoner of Love is a quote of Jean Genet, a novel of that same name. And Jean Genet was a writer, all-around bad boy, but someone who worked with these radical black movements in the US. And one of the opening lines in Prisoner of Love is, "Black Americans are the ink that give a white page its meaning." And so I created a show that was thinking about kind of an American story, an American experience, but through Black history and Black narratives. And at the center of that show is this incredible video by a filmmaker turned artist named Arthur Jafa. And the video is called Love is the Message. The Message is Death. And like the title of the show, Prisoner of Love, inside of the title of this work is also a paradox. And it's a paradox too, where he's thinking about the Black experience, both as a kind of heroism. You see Muhammad Ali, the perpetual champion, but also a history of violence. And there are, in this video, lots of images of police brutality, lynchings, There are images from the civil rights movement, all of that sort of interspersed with parties, with sports, and you get this incredible history that is walking through the Black experience from both trauma, deep trauma and violence, to transcendence and ecstasy and joy. And so he makes an argument that is, I think, saying that the Black American experience is to live in a constant state of paradox. But I'm interested in paradox for multiple reasons. Obviously, if I'm interested in multidisciplinary practice, I think that paradox can live together. And I believe that art shouldn't be logical, necessarily. Yes, it can be, but this is the place, art is a space where we can suspend logic and suspend rationality and live, I think, with paradox. And I just want to show a couple other artists that are in that exhibition. One is the painting that quotes the Jean Genet work, a work by Glenn Ligon, a textual work that changes the text from Black Americans to we. We are the ink. And to read a word that says we means that anyone who sees this work can be included in that narrative. What does it mean to be in the story of how America treats its minorities? And then there's Dina Lawson, a young photographer now who creates these incredibly powerful images that are somewhat inspired by her history as a fashion photographer. She started as a fashion photographer, but then gives you these images that seem slightly strange, slightly unreal, or maybe challenge the way you imagine how you see these figures. So she has a man, a quite like imposing man, who might be dealing in some unsavory activities. So there's a little arm to the left with a wad of cash. It doesn't look exactly legal, but he also has his baby and all the stuff around him about family. So again, we have to learn to suspend a little bit of disbelief and logic somehow to live through these experiences or live through these works.
Those are all staged photographs, the way...
Exactly. She takes images that look candid as if she just walked into somebody's house and took a picture, when in fact, she very carefully stages everything and places the material around everyone. She very intentionally has that other arm in the photo. And in fact, it's a quote of another historic photographer. Yeah. There's a work by Seydou Keita, a Malian photographer, who did he was a studio photographer who was probably one of the biggest chroniclers of high life in West Africa, starting in the 50s, going through the 70s, even into the 80s. And one of his most famous images is a man, giant man, in a big boo-boo. I mean, he has this cape that like goes out 3 feet in either direction, a meter in either direction, and a big crown, and he has this little baby. He's so proud of this child. And so Dina is creating these images that again look like documents to us, look sometimes confusing, but are also referencing art history. So that's what I've been up to.
Fantastic. I mean, I had the privilege of being in Chicago a week ago. It was a bit cold, but I got a chance to take a peek at Naomi's exhibition that had just opened, A Prisoner of Love, and Arthur Jafa's video is mind-blowing. Like, if you have a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. As you said, I mean, it's really fascinating for me how you work in how you present your work in such a responsible way, I think, and the care of the way you work with the artist and the way you install it at the museum is very palpable through your work and the way you were saying. So I don't know if there's any questions from the audience now, or we can continue the informal conversation.
Don't be shy.
I mean, something that for me is quite fascinating is that you do have this kind of like kind of insane curatorial pedigree that you've been working within the museum for a while, not only in Chicago but before that at the Studio Museum Harlem in New York City, and then it was the ICA Philly, exactly. And in my case, for example, I've been working in museums for the last 7 years, and I just took this kind of like weird detour where I went to a very small nonprofit. But I think it's fascinating to see the work and the commitment of someone like you spearheading as senior curator at the MCA Chicago, this very important work. And and there is, it takes some talent and some gut to like be able to remain in these institutional positions for a while. Maybe you can speak a little bit about why you see that it's so important of like, and being in Chicago, especially if you're as someone who grew up in Chicago.
First of all, thank you for all those kind words. And Jose, I have to thank you also publicly because in his transition from Chicago to New York, he also gave me incredible ideas for Prisoner of Love. So there are things that play out in the exhibition that are very important to thank you.
We used to share an office together,
yeah,
so it's kind of fantastic to be able to see Naomi now here.
Yeah, it's true, and continue the gossip. Yes, you're right. I really did, as I said at the top of this talk, make a particular decision to work in museums. And you're also right to point out it's not always easy. I'm not gonna, okay? No. It's not easy. I mean, yeah, you have great colleagues, but you're also dealing with a bureaucracy. No matter how small or large it is, there are things that you have to negotiate every step of the way. So it's not like I walk in and say, I want to do this, give me some money, let's put it together. No, not in the least bit. I have to defend every decision. I have to figure out how to pay for every decision. But I do think the drive is kind of an activism. I do consider myself an activist as a curator. I mean, I don't mean to sound immodest, but it's more important for me to see more Black artists in museum collections, to see more books about Black artists, than to see my name on a wall. Like, I don't need to produce 20,000 shows, a minute or a year. I don't need to publish forever. What I need to see is a different kind of conversation in and around art history. When I came back to Chicago, it was important for me to do this show, The Freedom Principle. And the funny thing is, I wasn't the first person to propose it. We had another curator on staff, came from Berlin, and he was obsessed with the AACM, so he started that conversation, which was great to see this international reach of this work that happened on the south side of Chicago in the 60s and 70s, come back into the museum. And it was important for me to do that show in particular because it was like a gift to my hometown. I can now make a book. I can now do a show that celebrates where I came from. But I also believe that there was a conceptual thing happening. And that is to say that, again, if in my childhood, it was important to think of all the arts together, then it is also important for me as a curator to do that same intellectual work. Many curators focus on one thing, one form, one artist, one kind of practice. Some people are dedicated to abstract painting and will never see anything else. Some people do drawing until the day they drop dead. I cannot do that. And I cannot do that both because of this intellectual upbringing, but also because if my activism surpasses even, this kind of career arc and the specialization, then I have to be what's called a generalist. Not all Black artists do the same thing. So I have to follow what the artists do. And therefore it's important, again, to keep that open mind, that capacious practice, and bring as many artists as possible into these institutions.
And it was interesting. I don't know if you noticed it. I joined the MCA Chicago in 2016, and it was very interesting to see the type of conversations that the kind of like senior curatorial team was having. And I imagine this changed dramatically depending on like who's sitting on the table, correct? I mean, Naomi had been there previously, but there was a moment when it was Naomi, Omar Khalif, who was grew up in Egypt, or an Egyptian born curator, very, very much interested in artists from the Middle East. And myself was working at the time almost very specifically with artists from Latin America. And of course, this is also something that happens to us. I think it's like I'm interested in many more artists beyond Latin America, but it was in these kind of like senior kind of curatorial meetings where if you have one slot of an exhibition a year, of course I'm going to choose to work with someone from Latin America. And it's the importance of kind of like representation, but also through who's sitting at that table. And at the MCA, I think it was quite special to be able to have those conversations. And I'm sure, I mean, I don't know if it shifted with the previous team before, and that starts to reflect in the programming also.
That's a good question about how it played out beforehand. I mean, one thing that's nice is I think we've all had a general agreement about the importance of multiple stories. I'm not going to name names. There's some people who are going to be specifically interested in North America and Western Europe. It just is what it is. But that person is not going to refuse the idea that we need to be thinking more globally. That said, you're right. There is this sense for some people, both artists and curators, that once you're inside the institution, you have to speak for a kind of identity and a kind of community. A lot of people are annoyed by that. I've never actually been ambivalent about it. I had no problem, no problem with this because, as I said, it was already embedded in my work and in my practice. That doesn't mean that's all I'm doing. My next show in 2 weeks is Laurie Simmons, again another artist who I love and whom I adore, but a white American woman who I learned a lot from as a feminist, and who I think has more relationship in thinking about identity than people give her credit for. So it's important to have those conceptual conversations. But you're right, you choose your battles. When given the opportunity, and knowing that it might be the last time in a long time, someone that you think needs to be in the slot, or the kind of body you think needs to be in the slot may have the opportunity, you go for it. I know why I was hired. I absolutely did that on purpose.
Is there any other questions from the audience?
How long does one...
Sorry I was late, actually.
How long does one stay a curator? Like, is it something that becomes the same thing, or do curators generally want to move from museums to museums and get different experiences and have their influence in as many places as they can?
I'll start, but I'd love to hear your answer to this too. I think there's two questions there. How long does one remain a curator, but also how long does one remain a curator in one institution? It's changing. Historically, one will try to come to an institution and stay for as long as possible. And I often say curating is like, in a museum, it's like the military. Like, you come in at grunt level and you just work your way up from private to ensign, I don't know actually the levels, captain, corporal, admiral, something like this. And so this happens also in museums. With more experience, then you have a higher title. The bigger the museum, the longer that takes, and the longer people tend to stay. However, in the contemporary museums, especially smaller ones, people tend to move around a lot more. You're right, it's almost 8 years that I'm at the MCA. That's actually kind of abnormal.
In the same position?
Not the same position, no, I've moved up in captainhood or what have you. But I'm not there just to move up. Again, I'm there to make arguments. And so I stay at a place as long as I think I can make arguments. The other thing that's changed too is how long do you stay inside how long do you stay as a curator? Again, more so in the contemporary field, but you see it in other fields too. People tend to become directors. And it's almost understood that certain curators will become directors, and people will take classes, they will go to business school, they will learn all sorts of things about management to take over an institution. I wish them all luck. I'm not going to deny that it will probably happen to me one day. It's not the ultimate goal.
We can't wait.
It's not the ultimate goal. It probably will happen. But again, I feel as though there are more arguments to be made, and I'll be happy becoming a director when I feel as though I've set the groundwork for something, and then I can move on.
I had a very, very different kind of career, actually. I was trained as an architect in Mexico, in Guadalajara, and then I eventually moved to New York City and started an internship at this small organization, small nonprofit called Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is where I'm now back 12 years later as director. But it's a very, very different kind of scale. It's a very small staff, and it's a very small exhibition space, but somehow it has had a really kind of big presence within the kind of contemporary art and architecture fields. I only realized recently that David Hammonds was on the board for a while, which is crazy. It was founded by an artist and an architect. Shireen Nishat is one of the artists, who's this kind of major Iranian artist. Dan Graham had one of his first shows there, and it's had this kind of like incredible legacy. But for me, while it was a very difficult decision to make, especially after I had only been in Chicago for 2.5 years, and this position was offered to me, and I had the opportunity to kind of like consider what I should do really, it really was a difficult decision. I consulted it with many people, and many said you should stay at the museum. They're like, stay at the museum. You work at a very good museum, and you've only been there for 2.5 years. Some said, look at Naomi, but it's true. It's like there's these like kind of like long careers, but for me it was. I just feel like there's already people like Naomi that are doing these kind of like battles in museums, and I thought that for me it was important to kind of be able to experiment and work in these other kind of like. It's a completely different type of institution where in a way like almost like everything and nothing is at stake. Almost like you can close the gallery one day and it's okay, but at the same time you're able to experiment and really try to push boundaries, and that's something that I'm interested in doing now. Work very closely with artists and really try to do things that I couldn't be able to do anywhere else. And I mean, I feel very lucky I am director, but also chief curator. We're a very, very small staff. So whereas in Chicago I was organizing maybe one exhibition a year or every 1.5 years, now I'm going to be doing 4 shows a year with public. So it's a very, very different scale and speed and way of interacting with artists. There's really no bureaucracy. It's almost the opposite. It's like literally me working directly with an artist and inviting them to come and put a show together. So eventually, to be honest, I would want to go back to museums, I think. And if I am aiming at like staying here for a while and really kind of like try to make an interesting program. But how long does one stay a curator? I mean, I want to do many other things in my life also. Eventually, I'd love to make a film or do a PhD in my 60s.
Cookbook.
Do a PhD when I'm 60.
Yeah, of course, my mother did. Yeah. But you know, there's something interesting too, that people kind of go back and forth sometimes. So it used to be thought that once you become a director, that's the end of the career, and then you go on to like, I don't know, retirement home or something. But I do know of curators who were once directors. You know, they were curators before, went into a directorship, and then decided they just want to make exhibitions again. They want, you know, the time with art, the time with reading, the time writing. It really is kind of a special place when you have the time. And my favorite example of that is Lowry Stokes Sims, a really incredible woman who was the first African-American curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And Lowry was there for 25 years at the Met. I mean, and barely moved up, honestly. Anyway, at some point, she was almost recruited to become the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I used to work, and she was there at the helm when I started. And then she was done. Like 5 years into it, she thought she had done her duty for the community, for these artists, and she went to the Museum of Art and Design. And her title is just curator. She's like, I don't want senior, I don't want chief, I don't want a name, I just want curator. Lowry's name is curator.
Any other questions?
Are there curators in the audience? I think secretly, yes.
I'm asking this because you're an architect and you've been working in art, and I would assume there's a lot of design influence in your thinking now. Where does design fit into contemporary art museums right now?
You mean as a discipline or in the way we organize exhibitions? As a discipline. It depends on where you are. Again, more common in the contemporary and modern museums. I mean, in the more historic Beaux-Arts museums, they tend to be more anthropology, craft, but those are honestly principles of design. MoMA in the US has probably the best design program and architecture program and project, and they do have specialists whose job is to make sure you write really deep histories about this. My institution dabbles from time to time, and we tend to try to wrap it back into a conversation around art, because there's no one who's really a design specialist where we are. And this is what's interesting to me around the contemporary. We want to be generalist, I'm not the only one, but we also still feel the need to specialize. So though you have an architecture background, our boss had an architecture background as well even, who has a bigger interest in design, I think, and does shows now with fashion designers and so forth. At the end of the day, you still want to make sure somebody knows what they're talking about. So I'm hesitant to, let's say, do a design project. I really have, but I'm hesitant.
You're working with a fashion designer.
I'm also working with fashion, but he's acting like an artist. So.
No, it's interesting. The MCA does have in Chicago does have a very kind of expansive understanding of what to present. And I think it reflects very much on the Chicago community, like on the audience in Chicago. So I'm actually working on an exhibition about an architect for Chicago. So Lina Obardi, a Brazilian architect, Italo Brazilian architect, and Naomi's working on an exhibition with Dura Olo, who's a fashion designer. But there are, I don't know, I think very expansively on the concept of design, really, and I think that it's important to, you presented yourself as interested in kind of like this multidisciplinarity, and I think contemporary culture has to kind of like reflect that, how everything is somehow influencing the other, right? Whether it's music to architecture to design and whatnot, and art. ¿Algo más?
Hi. How difficult is it to grab an audience by the hand and follow the artist's voice without sort of breaking the tune that he wants to portray?
This is the job. That is the only job, actually. I think it's an excellent question. And especially in a museum, it is a very fraught, a very complicated answer, because every museum imagines who their audience is. They have a sense that, oh, this kind of person is the person who comes here, and this is what they know, and this is how they can talk, and this is their reading level, blah, 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 blah. So we have, even in my museum, this relatively small museum, a department whose job is to help me shape language so that I can speak to our audience. Now, I actually do think that's really important. I won't say all the methods I absolutely agree with, but the other part of me being in a museum isn't just about the artist, it's about the audience. Because museums are the places where people go to see the artist. And so therefore, my only job is to find a way to make sure that the artist and the audience can have a conversation in the space of an exhibition. Now, I also work in the contemporary field for another important reason, and that is the artists tend to be alive. And therefore, I believe that I have to do my exhibitions in collaboration with the artist. That I don't walk in and say, this is exactly what your work is, and this is what we're going to do with it. I always have a conversation and ask, what is it that you're working for? What's really important to you? And then I say, this is what I see. And then we together start crafting a story. I think an exhibition really is about story. And then it becomes my job with my colleagues at the institution to say, does this story now make sense to an audience? And so I do think this is really important to not override the artist and then just present the work as whatever we think the audience wants. But I also think it's important not to override the audience and then create something that is incomprehensible to them. You have to be able to tell a story. And there are multiple ways to do that. I don't think there's one set way. This is super important to foster the dialogue.
I mean, it's also completely different in museums. And where I am now, for example, I'm kind of designing a curatorial framework for the exhibitions that we're going to do. So it's kind of like loosely themed exhibitions, basically. that I, as a curator with the team, kind of work on. And then we actually, basically the invitations that we're making to artists are within a certain kind of conceptual, theoretical framework already, and almost asking them to work on something very specific. So it's like it's commissioning new work, but it's also within the framework of a discourse that, as an institution, we're interested in exploring. So it's not necessarily that I'm asking them to do something very specific. Like there's a lot of ways to kind of to experiment and expand on that as well.
I think the important thing for this is trust. It's important for the artist to trust you. I mean, I rarely work with an artist I've just met. You know, there has to be a relationship there. They have to trust my intellect. I have to know their work. And then secondly, I think the audience has to trust us. I mean, if they're there, they trust us a little bit too, but you know, I'm always interested if an audience member just calls bullshit. Like, what is that? You know? I mean, again, this is really about relationship building. Even if the artist and someone, a visitor, never met, you have to, in the moment of the show, make a relationship between them.
For sure, it's the studio visit, the multiple studio visits, the drink, the coffee, and to really try to. I mean, you establish like really tight relationships within a museum context, which is very different. It's like you work on an exhibition for 2-3 years, and you're going to be in daily conversations with these people, so you have to like each other. I don't know if there's any other questions. And if not, I think we can wrap this up and just thank Naomi for the incredible job that she does in Chicago and beyond, and for being here with us today. I hope she's been seeing Fair already, so it's fantastic to be able to have curators like her in town for a few weeks and meet the galleries and see new artists, and spend some nice time in Mexico City.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.